The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a canvas of restless blue waves colliding against jagged volcanic cliffs. From above, the islands appeared quiet, isolated, almost lifeless, rings of black stone crowned with green jungles, their craters yawning like ancient scars carved by fire. To most, these places seemed forsaken, a wilderness shaped by lava and storms. But to those who understood war, they held secrets waiting to be unlocked. In the silence of those volcanic craters lay the possibility of turning nature itself into a fortress. If you are fascinated by untold stories of history, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the hidden chapters that shaped our world. Captain Daniel Hayes felt the weight of that hidden promise the moment his transport ship neared the shores of Tinian. Standing at the rail, he inhaled the heavy, humid air, thick with salt and the distant scent of burning vegetation. The sky was streaked with ash-grey clouds, and the volcanic ridges in the distance seemed to watch silently, daring him to set foot upon them. He had been in the Army Air Forces long enough to see Europe's fields and deserts in North Africa, yet the Pacific was different, raw, unforgiving, and cloaked in mystery. Hayes was an engineer by training, but war had turned him into something more, a builder of impossibilities. His orders were clear: construct runways where none should exist, transform volcanic craters into hidden air bases, and do it under the gaze of an enemy that ruled the seas and skies. To succeed meant survival for thousands. To fail meant disaster, not only for his men, but for every future operation relying on these islands. As the ship dropped anchor, Hayes studied the shoreline. Chamorro fishermen pulled in nets near the reefs, their dark eyes flickering toward the American vessel. He had read reports of islanders torn between survival and suspicion, living under Japanese occupation and brutality for years. Every gesture, every look carried layers of history he barely understood. He wondered if they saw him as a liberator, an intruder, or just another soldier in an endless parade of uniforms. His hand tightened around the rail as he thought of his men. They were not seasoned fighters, but builders, mechanics and surveyors, men of sweat and grit, trained to carve airstrips from Earth. They would soon face not only Japanese patrols, but also the volatile terrain itself. The very ground beneath their boots could betray them, collapsing into hidden lava tubes or flooding in sudden rains. And above, enemy aircraft prowled like hawks, searching for any sign of American presence. "Sir," Sergeant Alvarez's voice cut through his thoughts. A stocky man with grease-stained hands and a restless energy, Alvarez had been Hayes's right hand since Africa. "The men are ready. They've been whispering about what we're supposed to do here. Some think the brass has gone crazy." Hayes allowed himself a faint smile. "Maybe they have," he replied, his eyes still fixed on the jagged silhouette of the cratered island. "But sometimes it takes a little madness to change the course of a war." The words tasted heavy. He knew the challenge before them was more than logistical. It was a test of human endurance, of imagination stretched against limits. As waves slapped against the hull, Hayes wondered how long it would take before the enemy realized what they were doing. And when that happened, would the craters protect them or become their tombs? The island loomed closer, its volcanic ridges casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower. The first chapter of their mission was about to begin, and Hayes felt a shiver of both fear and determination. Nature and war were colliding here, and only one side would bend. He drew a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and prepared to lead his men into a place where stone, fire, and secrecy would decide their fate. The landing craft scraped against the shore of Tinian, its metal hull groaning as if reluctant to release its cargo. Captain Daniel Hayes stepped down into the shallow surf, his boots sinking into the warm sand. The heat pressed against him like a heavy cloak, and the salty wind carried with it the mingled scents of seaweed, smoke, and damp earth. Behind him, his men stumbled ashore with crates, toolkits, and weary determination. The island revealed itself in fragments, palm trees bending under the weight of humidity, cliffs rising black and jagged like the teeth of some ancient beast, and beyond them, a jungle so dense it seemed to breathe. Every sound, the buzzing insects, the rustling fronds, the distant cries of seabirds, felt amplified by the tension coiling inside Hayes's chest. "Sir, doesn't look like much," Alvarez muttered, adjusting the strap of his pack. Sweat already glistened on his brow. "But it smells like trouble." Hayes studied the shoreline. A group of Chamorro islanders watched from a distance, their faces unreadable. They stood barefoot on the sand, their clothes worn but dignified. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at the sight of foreign soldiers spilling onto their island. Some men held fishing spears, though none in a threatening manner. Their silence was heavier than words, and Hayes felt the weight of their gaze as though it pierced his uniform. "Keep your men respectful," Hayes said quietly to Alvarez. "This is their home, not ours." "Yes, sir, but you can feel it. They've been through hell already." He wasn't wrong. The reports Hayes had read on the ship lingered in his mind, stories of Japanese occupation, of villagers forced into labor, of food seized and lives crushed under suspicion. The islanders carried those scars in the way they stood, proud yet cautious, as if weighing whether these new arrivals would be any different from the last. Private Collins, barely 20, broke the silence as he hauled a crate up the beach. "Captain, do you think they'll help us?" His voice carried both hope and nervousness. Hayes paused before answering. "Help us, maybe. Trust us? That takes time. Don't expect it overnight." As the soldiers moved inland, the ground grew treacherous. Roots twisted across narrow paths, and volcanic rock jutted like blades from the soil. Every step was an effort, the air thick and stifling, sweat pouring down their backs. Hayes felt the resistance of the land itself, as though the island were testing their resolve before allowing them further. At a clearing, they paused to rest. The men dropped their packs, gulping canteens dry. Flies swarmed instantly, relentless and biting. Hayes crouched, tracing his hand along the cracked surface of a lava flow hardened into stone. It was sharp, porous, almost alien. Here, he thought, they would have to build something the world had never seen. He sensed eyes on him and turned. An elderly islander had approached quietly, his bare feet silent on the path. He wore a faded shirt and carried himself with the calm of someone who had endured storms greater than this. He spoke in broken English, his voice low but firm. "You fight Japan here?" the man asked. Hayes straightened, choosing his words carefully. "We're here to build, to fight, yes, but also to protect. No one should live in fear forever." The old man's gaze lingered on him, measuring, then shifted to the soldiers resting nearby. With a slow nod, he turned back toward the jungle, vanishing into green shadows without another word. Alvarez let out a low whistle. "That's one way to get judged, sir." Hayes exhaled slowly. "Every move we make here is being judged. By the enemy, and by the people who've lived with them. We can't afford to forget that." The sun dipped lower, staining the sky with molten orange. The men gathered their gear and prepared to push deeper inland. Hayes glanced once more at the horizon, feeling the vastness of the Pacific behind him and the uncertainty of the jungle ahead. Whatever awaited them in those volcanic ridges, it would demand more than steel and sweat. It would demand understanding, patience, and a respect for the land and people who had endured long before their arrival. The jungle pressed close around them, thick with vines and the scent of damp earth. Every rustle seemed louder than it should be, every shadow a possible threat. Captain Hayes knew the enemy was near, even if unseen. The island was small and the Japanese had been entrenched here long before his men landed. It was impossible to move without drawing notice eventually. They advanced along a narrow trail until Private Collins stumbled on a rusted tin can buried in the dirt. Hayes's gaze snapped toward it immediately. It wasn't trash, it was a warning. The Japanese often use such subtle signs to mark paths or signal scouts. He crouched, touching the can, then glanced into the trees. "They're watching us," he muttered. Alvarez grunted, adjusting his rifle, though their orders forbade drawing attention. "Wouldn't surprise me. I can feel their eyes, like the jungle itself is spying." Hayes kept his voice steady. "Eyes don't kill. Guns do. Stay alert but calm." Yet calm was difficult. A faint drone carried over the treetops, the sound of engines. Everyone froze. The men tilted their heads upward as a Japanese reconnaissance plane cut across the sky. Its silver belly flashed briefly in the sunlight before disappearing behind clouds. Hayes's jaw tightened. If that plane had spotted them, secrecy was already compromised. "Sir," Collins whispered, "should we hide?" "Not yet. Moving suddenly will give us away. Stay still. Let the trees cover us." Minutes crawled by until the sound faded. Relief washed through the ranks, but Hayes knew better than to relax. The Japanese controlled the skies, and one pass could mean more would follow. He urged his men forward, deeper into the volcanic ridges where overhanging stone offered better cover. Far away, inside a commandeered village hut, Colonel Kenji Saito studied maps under the dim glow of a lantern. His sharp features remained expressionless as a scout knelt before him, reporting in hushed tones. "American soldiers landed on Tinian. Not many." "Engineers, perhaps?" Saito's brow furrowed slightly. Engineers meant construction, and construction meant preparation for something larger. He had served across China and the Pacific long enough to recognize the pattern. The Americans were never idle. Wherever they came, they built, and from what they built, they struck. "Where?" Saito asked. The scout hesitated. "Near the craters, Colonel." "The ones the villagers call cursed." Saito allowed himself a faint smile, though his eyes remained cold. "Cursed for them, perhaps, but useful for us. If they dig into those craters, they will be vulnerable, like rats in a pit." He dismissed the scout and stared at the map, tracing the contours of volcanic ridges with his finger. He respected the Americans' resourcefulness, but despised their arrogance. They assumed islands could be reshaped at will, as though the land itself would bend to foreign will. Saito intended to prove them wrong. Back in the jungle, Hayes and his men reached a ridge overlooking a crater. The sight stopped them in their tracks. The crater spread wide, ringed with jagged stone, its floor hidden beneath a patchwork of greenery. From above, it looked like nothing more than another scar of nature. But Hayes saw possibility. "This," he whispered, "is where we'll build." The men exchanged uncertain glances. Collins frowned. "Sir, we're sitting ducks here. One flyover and—" Hayes cut him off gently but firmly. "Not if we use the crater itself as our shield. Nature built this fortress long before we arrived. We'll let it hide us." Alvarez ran a hand across the black stone. "It'll take sweat and pain to make this place useful." "Then that's what it'll take," Hayes replied. He stared into the shadows of the crater, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. They were being watched, of that he was sure. But secrecy was their only weapon now, and this crater was both a gamble and a hope. The jungle around them seemed to whisper warnings, as if alive with unseen listeners. Hayes's men shifted uneasily, their nerves fraying. He knew morale would be tested with every step, every hammer strike echoing against stone. The Japanese shadow was here, close, pressing in. Still, he set his jaw and gave the order to begin marking the ground. Whatever came, they would build, and they would not be found, at least not yet. The first swings of pickaxes against the crater floor echoed like defiance against the silence of the island. Hayes watched his men work, their movements awkward at first, the lava rock resisting every strike. It was not soil they dug into, but hardened fire, sharp and brittle, cracking unpredictably beneath the tools. The sun bore down mercilessly, heat radiating from both the sky and the black stone beneath their boots. Sweat poured, shirts clung, tempers flared. Private Collins slammed his shovel into the ground, sparks jumping as metal struck rock. "Sir, we're never going to dig through this." "It's like trying to break God's own anvil." Hayes crouched, running his hand over the jagged surface. The crater was both promise and punishment. "It can be broken," he said, "but not with strength alone. We'll need leverage. We'll need to be smarter than the rock." Alvarez spat to the side, his face red from the effort. "Smart is good, Captain, but we're running low on supplies. We don't have the heavy drills, not enough dynamite, and half the gear's already giving out. What then?" The frustration was real, and Hayes felt it gnaw at him. Command had promised equipment, but shipments were delayed, rerouted, or lost to the sea. What reached them was barely enough to keep moving forward. Each broken shovel or snapped pick handle meant another setback, another blow to morale. The rains came suddenly, as they always did in the Pacific. In the middle of their digging, clouds rolled in, heavy and dark, releasing torrents that turned dust to mud and revealed hidden weaknesses in the crater floor. Pools of water gathered in low spots, soaking boots and supplies alike. Hayes waded through it, barking for tarps and trenches to redirect the flow. "Sir!" a soldier shouted. A section of freshly carved rock had given way under the rain, collapsing into a small sinkhole. Mud and stone swallowed half the tools stacked nearby. The men swore and scrambled, trying to salvage what they could. Hayes stood over the hole, feeling the sharp pang of doubt stab at him. Was this crater a blessing or a trap? When the storm passed, the air turned thick and steamy, their uniforms clinging like wet rags. The crater reeked of sulfur released from fractured stone. Hayes gathered his officers under the dripping palms at the rim. "We can't fight the land head-on," he said firmly. "If we do, it'll break us before the enemy ever fires a shot." "What's the alternative?" Alvarez asked, frustration edging his tone. "We don't have the machines. We don't have the manpower. All we've got is sweat." Hayes's gaze hardened. "Then we use sweat wisely. We focus on areas where the rock's already weak. We cut channels for water before it floods us again. We adapt." The men listened, exhausted but attentive. Hayes's voice carried conviction because it had to. Inside, doubt gnawed at him, yet outwardly he stood unshaken. He had to be the fulcrum on which their will balanced. That night, lanterns flickered against the crater walls as the soldiers ate meager rations. The jungle hissed with unseen creatures, and distant thunder rolled like artillery. Collins sat nearby, poking at his food. "Captain," he said quietly, "do you really think we can pull this off? Or are we just digging our own graves out here?" Hayes looked at him, the young man's eyes reflecting both fear and hope. He answered steadily, "Every grave I've ever seen in war was dug because men stopped believing they could endure. We don't stop." "Not here, not now." Collins swallowed hard, nodding slowly. His doubt didn't vanish, but it dulled beneath the weight of Hayes's certainty. Around them, others leaned closer, silently absorbing their captain's words. Hayes lay awake long after the camp settled. The crater loomed around them, a blackened crown of jagged stone. It was unforgiving, yes, but he felt its hidden promise, too. If they could bend this land to their will, it would shelter them, shield them, and strike back at the enemy. For now, though, it was only stone, rain, and the iron resolve of tired men. Nights inside the crater were long, humid, and heavy with silence. The men lay in their makeshift tents, listening to the drip of water down stone walls and the occasional distant cry of birds echoing through the jungle. Sleep came slowly, broken by mosquitoes and restless thoughts. It was in these hours, when work paused and war seemed momentarily distant, that the soldiers' humanity surfaced most clearly. Private Collins sat cross-legged, scribbling furiously on a piece of paper lit by lantern glow. His lips moved as he read aloud in a whisper. Alvarez noticed and nudged him. "Writing to your girl again?" Alvarez teased, though his tone carried no malice. Collins flushed but smiled. "Yeah, she doesn't know what this place looks like. I don't think I could explain it if I tried." Hayes, who had been cleaning his boots nearby, glanced up. "Tell her the truth, not about the danger, we all leave that out, but about what keeps you going here. Families need to believe there's still light in us, even in a place like this." The words carried weight. For a moment Collins stopped writing, his brow furrowed. Then he nodded and began again, slower this time. Across the camp, Corporal Jensen pulled out a harmonica. The first notes were hesitant, but soon a familiar tune floated into the humid night. Soldiers gathered, some humming along, others tapping boots in rhythm. The simple melody transformed the crater from a prison into something resembling home. "Never thought I'd hear music out here," Alvarez murmured, closing his eyes briefly. "Almost makes you forget we're surrounded by hell." Hayes didn't answer. Instead, he studied the men. Exhaustion and worry still clung to their faces, but in these small rituals, letters, songs, shared jokes, there was strength. He felt pride swelling inside him, though tempered with the knowledge that he bore responsibility for keeping that spirit alive. Later, as the fire dimmed, Collins approached Hayes quietly. "Sir, can I ask something?" Hayes nodded. "Why do you take this assignment? You could have stayed back with the brass safe. Instead, you're down here in the mud with us." Hayes leaned against a rock, thinking carefully. "Because someone has to prove it can be done, and because I won't ask men to suffer through something I'm not willing to face myself. Leadership isn't about distance, it's about standing where it's hardest and saying, 'Follow me.'" Collins absorbed the words, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Guess that's why we trust you. Trust." The word lingered in Hayes's mind long after Collins left. Trust was fragile, easily broken, yet it was the thread holding them together. Without it, the mission would collapse long before stone or storm could break them. As dawn approached, a thick mist rolled over the crater, clinging to uniforms and tools alike. The men rose groggy but rallied quickly, falling into routines that now felt almost natural. They shared canteens, adjusted each other's packs, offered rough humor to soften the day's grind. Alvarez cracked a grin at Hayes as they prepared to resume work. "You know, Captain, for a bunch of engineers and mechanics, these boys are starting to look like a real unit." "Not soldiers maybe, but something stronger." Hayes returned the smile faintly. "Not stronger, closer. A machine breaks without its parts. Men break without each other." The work was grueling, yet the rhythm of unity carried them. Each swing of a pickaxe, each shovel of gravel, was less about muscle and more about shared resolve. They began to anticipate one another's movements, covering weaknesses, lending strength. By the end of the day, the crater floor bore the first faint outlines of order carved from chaos. Exhausted, blistered, and soaked in sweat, the men looked upon their progress with weary satisfaction. For the first time since arriving, Hayes saw something in their faces that surpassed fatigue: pride. They were no longer just a group of soldiers thrown together by orders. They were becoming brothers, bound not by blood, but by the certainty that their survival and the mission itself depended on each other. The morning air carried a stillness that was rare on the island. Mist clung to the crater rim, softening the jagged outlines of volcanic stone. Hayes led a small team out of camp to scout for fresh water, following narrow paths carved by rain. Supplies were running thin, and the men were weary of drinking from barrels that tasted of rust and algae. As they pushed through thick vegetation, Alvarez halted suddenly, raising a hand. A figure emerged from the trees, a woman, slender, her clothes worn but clean. A small satchel slung over her shoulder. Her steps were cautious, but her eyes were sharp, assessing the Americans with quick precision. She spoke first, her English accented, but steady. "You look thirsty." Hayes studied her carefully, noting the way Alvarez's hand hovered near his rifle. "We are," Hayes admitted. "And who might you be?" "Maria Santos," she said. "From Luzon. I was a nurse before the war." The name struck Hayes. Luzon meant the Philippines, where Japanese occupation had turned every day into a battle for survival. She had risked much to reach this island. Hayes inclined his head respectfully. "Captain Daniel Hayes, U.S. Army Air Forces." "These are my men." Maria's gaze flicked over them, lingering on Collins, who was pale and coughing from the damp. She moved closer, kneeling without hesitation to check his pulse. Collins stiffened at her touch, but didn't pull away. "He needs cleaner water," she said bluntly, "and food that hasn't been sitting in metal cans for months." Alvarez frowned. "And I suppose you just happen to know where to find that?" Maria met his suspicion with calm. "Yes, the island provides more than you realize, if you know where to look." She gestured toward the ridge. "There is a spring nearby, hidden under stone. The Japanese don't know of it. I can take you there." Hayes felt the tension in the group. Trusting strangers was dangerous, yet turning her away could mean losing a chance at survival. He weighed the risk and nodded slowly. "Show us." They followed her through twisting paths until she stopped at a shaded hollow where clear water bubbled between rocks. The men crowded forward, relief etched into their faces as they filled canteens and splashed cool liquid over their skin. Collins drank deeply, coughing less afterward. "Feels like life itself," he muttered. Maria crouched nearby, her expression unreadable. "The land is generous if you respect it, but if you fight against it, it will destroy you." Her words struck Hayes deeply, echoing his own thoughts from nights staring into the crater walls. He turned to her. "Then perhaps you can teach us how to respect it better." In the days that followed, Maria became an unlikely ally. She showed them which plants could be eaten, how to recognize roots that carried clean water, and how to use palm leaves to keep supplies dry during storms. She even taught them quiet ways to move through the jungle without drawing attention, lessons learned from years of survival under Japanese eyes. At first, some soldiers remained skeptical. "What if she's feeding them information?" Jensen whispered one night. Hayes answered firmly, "Then we'll know soon enough. But look around you. Without her knowledge, half of us would already be sick." Trust is a gamble, but so is every breath we take here. Maria never asked for reward, though sometimes Hayes caught a flicker of sadness in her eyes when she looked toward the sea. One evening, as the men worked, she sat beside Hayes. "I lost my family in Luzon," she said quietly. "The Japanese took them. I don't know if they are alive. Helping you, it gives me purpose." Hayes nodded, understanding the weight of grief unspoken. "Then you're not alone anymore. We fight together now." For the first time, Maria's lips curved into a faint smile. In that fragile moment, Hayes sensed that the crater would no longer feel like a place of isolation. It was slowly becoming a place of unity, forged from trust, necessity, and a shared will to endure. The sun was high when the warning came. A low, distant rumble drifted across the sky, faint at first, then unmistakable, the hum of engines. Hayes froze mid-step, his stomach tightening. He glanced upward, the brightness forcing him to squint. Dark specks cut through the clouds, growing larger with every second. "Planes!" Alvarez barked, his voice sharp with urgency. The men dropped tools, their exhaustion forgotten in the rush of fear. Maria's hand shot out, pointing toward the rim of the crater. "Cover everything, fast!" Hayes reacted instantly. "Camouflage netting now, get the tarps over the supply piles." No movement once they're overhead. The soldiers scrambled, dragging nets woven with palm fronds across equipment, blending metal and wood into the jagged crater floor. Shovels and picks disappeared beneath hasty coverings. Sweat poured down their backs as adrenaline sharpened every motion. Collins tripped over a coil of rope, landing hard. "Damn it!" he hissed, scrambling to pull himself up. Hayes was beside him in an instant, hauling him to his feet. "No noise," Hayes warned in a whisper. "Noise carries." The engines roared louder. A Japanese scout plane cut into view, its silver wings glinting like a blade against the sky. It circled lazily, banking low enough that Hayes could make out the red insignia on its wings. His heart hammered. If the pilot saw anything unusual, freshly cut stone, unnatural shapes, everything they had built would be undone in minutes. The men crouched low, bodies pressed to the ground, every breath measured. The silence inside the crater was unbearable. Even the jungle seemed to hold its voice, as if nature itself conspired to hide them. "Think they see us?" Collins whispered, his voice trembling. Alvarez's jaw was tight. "If they do, we're finished." The plane circled once more, then tilted, its nose lifting as it climbed back into the clouds. The fading sound left only pounding hearts and the rasp of strained breathing. For a moment, no one moved. Then the men exhaled in unison, the release almost painful. Collins laughed nervously, his voice breaking. "That was too close." Hayes didn't smile. "Close calls are going to be normal here. The second we let our guard down, we're dead." Later that day, another threat tested their nerve. A Japanese patrol moved along the jungle's edge, just beyond the crater rim. Hayes and Maria watched from cover, the soldiers crouched beside them. 4 Japanese infantrymen moved carefully, their rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the ground. "They're looking for something," Maria whispered. Hayes's throat felt dry. He gestured for silence, motioning his men to remain hidden. Every creak of leather, every snapped twig could give them away. The patrol paused, one soldier kneeling to study the earth. Hayes's heart slammed against his ribs. If they found tracks leading into the crater, discovery was inevitable. But after tense minutes, the Japanese moved on, vanishing back into the jungle's green wall. Hayes allowed himself the smallest exhale of relief. When the danger passed, Collins's hands shook visibly. "Sir, how long can we keep this up? Can we—" "Feels like they're breathing down our necks every second." Hayes looked at the young private, his own exhaustion mirrored in the boy's eyes. "As long as it takes. Every day we're still here is proof they haven't beaten us." That night, the men worked in near silence, careful with every sound. Lanterns were shielded, voices lowered to whispers. The crater felt like a fortress and a trap all at once, a place where shadows lengthened and nerves frayed. Hayes walked the perimeter, his boots crunching softly on gravel. Above, the stars shone clear, indifferent to the tension below. He stopped, looking upward, and muttered to himself, "They don't know we're here yet. And until they do, we'll use every breath to keep it that way." But deep inside, he knew the close calls were mounting. One slip, one careless sound or mark left behind, and the fragile balance would shatter. The first warning came as a whisper in the air, a sudden shift that raised gooseflesh on the men's arms. Clouds, thick and bruised, gathered over the crater rim with unnerving speed. Maria looked upward, her expression tightening. "The rains," she said. "They're coming fast." Hayes had seen Pacific storms before, but nothing prepared him for the violence that followed. Wind tore through the crater like a living beast, snapping palm leaves into the air. The sky cracked open, and rain hammered down in sheets so heavy the world blurred into grey. "Get the supplies covered," Hayes shouted, his voice nearly drowned by the storm. The men scrambled, dragging tarps and crates toward higher ground, but water pooled faster than they could react, filling trenches and turning the crater floor into a churning swamp. Shovels sank into mud, boots slipped, curses flew. A sudden crack split the air as part of the crater wall collapsed, sending rocks tumbling into their worksite. Collins barely leapt aside in time, landing face first in the muck. Alvarez yanked him up by the collar, shouting through the storm, "Move, damn it! This place is falling apart!" Hayes's heart clenched. Weeks of progress vanished in minutes, as carefully leveled ground dissolved beneath torrents of rain. Wooden supports splintered, and mudslides buried half their tools. He forced himself forward, pulling ropes, lifting crates, his body straining against exhaustion. "Captain!" one soldier cried. Hayes turned just in time to see an entire section of the runway sink, swallowed by water and shifting earth. The sight was devastating, days of labor erased in a heartbeat. Maria appeared at his side, her hair plastered to her face, eyes burning with urgency. "You must dig channels. If the water has nowhere to go, it will take everything." Hayes snapped into action. "Alvarez! Jensen! Get men with shovels on the edges. Cut drains toward the outer rim." They obeyed, hacking furiously at the sodden ground while rain lashed at their backs. The channels filled instantly, rushing like miniature rivers. Slowly, painfully, the water began to recede from the heart of the crater. Still, the cost was heavy. By nightfall, the storm eased, leaving behind a wasteland of mud and broken tools. Lantern light flickered weakly across wreckage, casting long shadows over weary faces. The men sat in silence, their shoulders slumped. Collins stared at the ruined ground, his lips trembling. "All of it. Gone. What's the point, sir? We'll never keep up. Not against this." Alvarez slammed a fist against the stone, his voice raw. "The land hates us. It's not just the Japanese we're fighting, it's this cursed island itself." Hayes felt their despair like a weight pressing down on his chest. He was exhausted, soaked and cold, but he couldn't let them sink into defeat. He stood, his voice firm though his throat burned. "Listen to me. The storm took our work, but it didn't take us. That means we can start again. This crater, this land, it's brutal, yes, but it's also our shield. Every obstacle it throws at us, we turn into strength. Do you understand?" The men lifted their heads slowly, eyes meeting his. Some still doubted, but others clung to his conviction like a lifeline. Maria nodded beside him, her voice quiet but strong. "The land is not your enemy. It only tests you. Those who endure it will protect." Hayes seized on her words. "You heard her. If we endure, this place becomes ours. We don't quit. Not now, not ever." The silence stretched, broken finally by Alvarez's tired chuckle. "Guess that means we're back to digging tomorrow." A ripple of grim laughter followed, faint but real. They were battered, yes, but not broken. Hayes looked around the crater, its jagged walls gleaming with rain. Nature had struck back with fury, but it had failed to wash them away. Tomorrow would bring new battles, storms of sky and storms of war, but tonight, survival itself was a victory. The days that followed the storm were a blur of mud, exhaustion, and stubborn hope. The crater had swallowed their progress, but the men fought back like the island itself had become their opponent. Every step forward now felt like a small victory, each swing of the shovel a declaration that they would not be defeated by stone or rain. Hayes watched them work in silence, taking in the rhythm of the men's labor, their bodies aching, their faces drawn, but their resolve unbroken. The crater floor had finally been drained, and the skeletal structure of the airstrip began to emerge again, slower but with more clarity this time. They had learned from their mistakes, adapting their methods to the unforgiving land. "I've never seen a group of men work so damn hard," Alvarez muttered one evening, wiping his brow. "We're not just building a base, we're building something more." Hayes turned to him, sensing the underlying truth in Alvarez's words. It wasn't just about the airstrip anymore. The men had come to understand that they were shaping their fate here, that this crater, despite its seeming indifference, had become their last bastion. They weren't merely surviving, they were becoming part of the land, learning to coexist with its brutality. A week after the storm, the first piece of equipment arrived, an ancient bulldozer, rusted and barely operational. But to Hayes, it was a symbol of something larger. They now had the means to push forward in earnest, to rebuild what had been lost, and begin constructing what they'd come here to do. The bulldozer's engine coughed to life, a ragged sound, but it was music to their ears. "Finally," Jensen said, a wide grin spreading across his face as he climbed into the driver's seat. "Let's see if this thing can dig us out of this hellhole." Despite their exhaustion, the men rallied around the new machine, working together to clear the area and extend the runway. For the first time since the mission began, Hayes allowed himself to feel something close to hope. They weren't just fighting the land anymore, they were using it, shaping it to their will. Slowly, steadily, the airstrip grew. That night, as the men sat around a fire, Hayes noticed the difference in their demeanor. They no longer looked like soldiers marching through a war zone. They looked like builders, determined men with a purpose, bound together by something stronger than the walls of the crater. "We're doing it," Collins said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the stars were beginning to flicker. "We're actually doing it." Hayes sat back, his mind quiet for the first time in weeks. The weight of responsibility still pressed on his shoulders. But now there was a sense of momentum, a feeling that against all odds they were making progress. There was still much to do, but they had passed a point of no return. The base was no longer a distant dream, it was becoming a reality. The next morning, as they resumed work, Maria approached him, her face lined with concern. "The Japanese are getting more active," she said softly, her eyes scanning the tree line. "I can feel it. They know something is happening here." Hayes nodded, his mind already shifting gears. The threat was never far, but they had grown too comfortable in the shadow of their labor. The enemy was closing in, and the race against time had begun anew. "We'll finish the strip first," he said, his voice steady. "Then we'll make sure they never find us." But as the day wore on, Hayes couldn't shake the sense of urgency that had taken root in him. Every man working beside him now felt the tension of the coming conflict. The turning point had arrived, not in the form of progress, but in the reality that their enemies were closing in. The crater had offered them a temporary sanctuary, but the battle ahead would require more than just ingenuity and labor. It would demand everything they had. "Finish strong," Hayes said to his men that afternoon, as the roar of engines filled the air. "We're not just building an airstrip, we're building the future." As the sun dipped behind the jagged walls of the crater, Hayes allowed himself a fleeting moment of peace, knowing that whatever came next, they had forged something that could never be taken away. The tension in the air was palpable as Hayes watched his men work. the roar of the bulldozer blending with the persistent chirp of insects and the heavy weight of the jungle. They had made significant progress on the runway, the bones of an airstrip emerging from the raw earth. But Hayes knew they were on borrowed time. The Japanese, despite the island's isolation, were never far. The slightest misstep could alert them, and the base would be nothing more than a trap. Maria approached him one morning, her expression more serious than usual. "Captain," she began, glancing around as if to ensure no one overheard, "I've been hearing rumors from the islanders. They've seen more patrols, more planes in the sky. They're getting suspicious." Hayes's heart skipped a beat. He'd been expecting this. "What kind of suspicion?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "They know something is happening near the volcanoes. They've been asking questions, watching us from afar. We're too big a presence for them to ignore now." The urgency in her voice cut through Hayes like a cold wind. He had hoped they would be left alone long enough to finish the runway, but now it seemed the enemy was tightening the noose. He looked toward the horizon, his mind racing. "Do you think they've spotted us?" Alvarez asked, stepping up beside him. "I'm not sure," Hayes replied, his voice low. "But they're close. I can feel it. We need to be ready." For the next few days, Hayes and his team worked with even more caution. Every movement was deliberate, every noise carefully considered. They dug in silence, avoiding any unnecessary activity. They knew that the Japanese were masters of patience, and the longer they stayed in one place, the higher the risk of being discovered. Late one afternoon, as the men were finishing their work for the day, a loud noise sliced through the air, a distant rumble, almost like thunder. Hayes froze, instinctively looking to the sky. The shadow of an aircraft passed overhead, low and slow. His gut clenched. It was a Japanese bomber, its large silhouette unmistakable even from a distance. "Get down!" Hayes barked, signaling for the men to take cover. They scrambled for the nearest patches of jungle, pulling their bodies low to the ground, hands covering their heads. The bomber passed overhead, its engines thundering like a warning. "They're searching," Maria whispered from beside him, her voice barely audible. "This is not a routine patrol." Hayes's mind raced as the plane vanished into the distance. The men waited, hearts pounding in their chests, listening for the sound of enemy aircraft engines retreating into silence. The distant drone finally faded, but the threat remained. "They're getting too close," Alvarez muttered. "This is madness. We can't keep hiding like this." Hayes didn't respond immediately. He knew that fear was creeping into the ranks, fear of discovery, fear of failure. He had to hold them together, to maintain their focus. "We don't have the luxury of rushing. We finish the runway and then we'll be ready. But until then, we stay quiet." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to argue. They had all seen the power of Japanese forces in action, swift, unforgiving, and merciless. Their survival depended on silence and secrecy. As the sun began to set, Hayes's thoughts were far from the worksite. The tension in the air seemed to thicken, the weight of suspicion pressing down on them. He knew the Japanese wouldn't give up. They were closing in, and the longer it took to finish, the more likely it was that someone would slip up. Hayes watched as the last of the men filed into their makeshift shelters for the night. Maria lingered behind for a moment, her expression troubled. "We can't outrun them forever, Captain. If they find us, it will be over." "I know," Hayes replied quietly. "But we'll make sure they don't find us. Not until we're ready." But even as he spoke the words, Hayes couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. The enemy was getting closer, and the secret they'd fought so hard to protect was slipping through their fingers. As the night closed in, the jungle seemed to hold its breath, the quiet broken only by the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Hayes lay awake in his shelter, staring into the darkness, waiting for the inevitable moment when they would be discovered. But until then, he would hold the line. The tension Hayes had been holding in his chest for weeks finally snapped one afternoon, just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the crater. They had been working long hours under the hot Pacific sun, each day blurring into the next. The men were exhausted, the weight of the mission pressing harder each day. It was as if the island itself was wearing them down, trying to break their spirits. And then that afternoon it happened. Sergeant Alvarez stormed into Hayes's makeshift office, his face flushed with anger. "Captain, this is getting out of hand." Hayes glanced up from the map spread out before him. He'd been reviewing their progress on the airstrip, but the fire in Alvarez's voice grabbed his attention. "What's going on, Sergeant?" "It's Collins," Alvarez snapped, pacing back and forth. "The kid's losing it. He's been acting out of line, snapping at men, dragging his feet on his duties. I don't know how much more of this we can take." Hayes's mind raced. Collins had been quiet for the last few days, and while his exhaustion was understandable, this was different. Something was fraying at the edges of the unit's resolve, and he knew this was a test, not just of Collins but of him as a leader. He stood and walked over to Alvarez, his voice calm but firm. "Get him here." "I'll speak with him." A few moments later, Collins appeared, his face drawn and pale. He looked like a man on the edge of collapse, his uniform stained with sweat, his eyes hollow. The burden of the last several weeks had taken its toll on him, just as it had on the others. Hayes studied the young private for a long moment, sensing the strain in him. "Collins, what's going on?" The words tumbled out of Collins's mouth in a rush. "I can't take it any more, sir. Every day it's the same thing. Dig, work, cover up, hide. I'm tired, I'm scared, and I don't think any of this matters." The honesty in his voice cut through Hayes like a blade. He could see the fear in Collins' eyes, the doubt, the weariness that had finally broken through. It wasn't just the physical work. It was the mental toll of living on edge, constantly under the threat of discovery. "You're not alone in this," Hayes said softly. "We all feel it. The fear, the pressure. But that's exactly why we're here. To survive. To finish what we started." Collins clenched his fists, his frustration bubbling over. "But for what? For who? We're just sitting ducks here waiting to be found. How much longer do we keep doing this?" Hayes's gaze softened, his voice steady but resolute. "As long as it takes. Because that's the only choice we have. Every day we're still here, we're winning. We're building something that will change the course of this war. We don't give up, Collins. Not now, not ever." There was a long pause. Hayes could see the internal battle raging inside the young man. He was so close to breaking, but Hayes wouldn't let him. He couldn't. "I know it's hard," Hayes continued, "but that's what makes us stronger. We do this together, or we don't do it at all. I can't do this alone, and neither can you. But together we can finish this." Collins's eyes flickered with a mix of emotion, doubt, fear, but also a spark of something else, a glimmer of hope, perhaps. He swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Yeah, you're right, sir. I'm sorry." Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "It's all right. You're not the first to feel this way, and you won't be the last. We're all in this together, and together we'll get through it." As Collins left, Hayes turned back to the map, his thoughts swirling. This was the moment. The mission was no longer just about the airstrip or the war. It was about the men he led, their strength and their ability to trust one another. The island, the enemy, the storm, all of it was just noise. The real battle was the one inside their minds. It wasn't just Collins who was struggling. The entire unit was on the edge, and Hayes could feel it in every step, every quiet moment when the men looked to him for answers. He wasn't just a captain anymore. He was their anchor, their lifeline in a storm that showed no signs of easing. Hayes stood up, his back straight. He had a job to do, and that job was more important now than ever. He had to lead these men not just to victory, but through their own doubts and fears. They had come this far, and they wouldn't stop now. Not while he was in charge. The first rumble in the sky was subtle, like the distant thunder of a storm. But Hayes knew better. He had learned to recognize the hum of enemy aircraft, the menacing promise of danger in the air. His eyes snapped to the horizon, where the unmistakable shape of a Japanese bomber appeared from behind the clouds. It was too high to be a direct threat, but Hayes didn't waste a second. "Take cover," he shouted, his voice cutting through the murmur of men working around the crater. The crew scattered, diving for whatever cover they could find, dipping into the mud, hiding behind rocks, and pulling up the camouflage netting. Every movement was measured, every step deliberate. They had been here long enough to know the drill, but Hayes could feel the tension mount as the engine's sounds grew louder, filling the air with a relentless dread. They were too exposed. The runway wasn't finished, and the makeshift defenses had been hastily thrown together. If the enemy found them now, there would be no hiding. It was their only chance. If they could remain undetected for a little while longer, they could finish what they had started. But it was getting more dangerous with every passing minute. "Captain," Alvarez's voice snapped Hayes from his thoughts. "We can't just stay here, we need to—" Before Alvarez could finish, the sky erupted in a roar. A second bomber appeared, low this time, its engines throttling as it swept across the crater. The men froze, hearts racing. Hayes's mind flashed to the memories of the bombs he had witnessed in other theaters. There was no way they could outrun this. The plane circled, its shadow passing over them like a harbinger of doom. Hayes's eyes darted to the men around him. There was no panic, no chaos, just the sharpness of men who had learned the rules of survival in a world governed by death. But this time, it felt different. The stakes had never been higher. "They're gonna spot us," Jensen muttered, his face pale. "We're done." Hayes's mind worked in overdrive, trying to piece together a plan. They were too exposed, the crater was too obvious, but if they could stall, just for a little longer, they might still have a chance. The bombers hadn't dropped anything yet. Maybe the Japanese were simply scouting. But no, that was wishful thinking. They would come back. Hayes knew that much. The bomber banked again, dipping lower. Hayes could see the pilot clearly now, his silhouette moving inside the cockpit. The danger was close, too close for comfort. Hayes's breath quickened. He had no choice but to make a move. "Get ready to move," Hayes barked, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We go when I say go. Hold tight." For a moment, time seemed to slow. The men around him gripped their rifles tighter, eyes wide, their breath shallow. Everything in Hayes screamed for action, but he held himself still. He had to be the calm in the storm, the one they looked to when the fear threatened to swallow them all. The bomber passed overhead again, so close that Hayes could feel the rush of wind from its engines. A sudden explosion rocked the earth, throwing debris into the air as the first bomb exploded 100 yards away. "Move!" Hayes shouted, leaping to his feet and sprinting toward the nearest cover. The ground trembled underfoot, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. The roar of the bomber faded momentarily, replaced by the deafening sound of men scrambling to safety. Hayes was already half out of sight when he glanced back. He saw the other men, some diving into the shallow trenches they had dug, others crawling under the makeshift tarps, and a few desperately covering equipment. Another explosion followed, closer this time, and the force of it sent a wave of panic rippling through the men. "Stay down!" Hayes shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "Stay down and don't move until I say." Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The bombing stopped, replaced by the eerie quiet of the jungle. Hayes held his breath, listening for the sound of the bomber returning. He could almost feel its engines rearing up for another run, but it didn't come. Instead, the last remnants of dust settled around them, the air heavy with the stench of explosives and burnt earth. Hayes's heart hammered in his chest as he counted heads. They were all accounted for. Collins, his face streaked with dirt, pulled himself from the dirt, his voice cracking. Did we survive?" Hayes nodded grimly. "For now." "We're not out of the woods yet." He looked around at his men. The bombing had only confirmed what they all knew deep down. They were running out of time. The Japanese were watching, and they would return. Every second they spent in this exposed position was another chance for disaster. They had to move fast, finish the runway, and prepare for the worst. But for tonight, all Hayes could do was make sure his men knew that they had survived this round. They had fought back the sky, and they were still standing. The morning sun broke through the lingering mist, casting the volcanic crater in an eerie glow. It had been a long night, one filled with nervous anticipation and the distant rumble of enemy planes. But now, the men moved with purpose. The runway was nearly complete. They had managed to repair the damage caused by the bombing, and every inch of ground felt like a hard-earned victory. Yet, Hayes couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that time was running out. "Captain," Alvarez called, his voice tense as he approached. "We've got one chance at this. If we don't get the planes in the air soon, we might as well pack up and go home." Hayes nodded, his eyes scanning the nearly finished runway. The dust from the earlier bombing still hung in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of scorched earth. But there was no time to waste. They had built this airstrip not just to survive, but to strike back, and that moment had arrived. "We're not going home, Sergeant," Hayes said, his voice steady. "Not until we've done what we came here to do." The men had worked tirelessly to get to this point. The makeshift airstrip had been patched together under extreme conditions, with limited resources and the ever-present threat of discovery. Hayes had led them through storm and threat, and now the culmination of all their efforts was within reach. Collins, his face grim but determined, walked up beside Hayes, holding a set of keys to the nearby aircraft. "You're sure this is going to work, sir?" Hayes looked at the young man. The doubt that had once clouded Collins's eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. "It has to work. We've done everything we can. Now we do what soldiers do, we fly." The engines of the planes roared to life, the sound of their power slicing through the stillness of the morning. The men gathered in a loose formation, watching as the first aircraft began to roll down the runway. Every eye was on it, every heart pounding in unison. "Here we go," Alvarez muttered, his gaze locked on the plane's movements. "This is it." The aircraft's wheels hit the tarmac, and for a moment it seemed as if nothing would happen. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, the plane lifted off the ground, its wings cutting through the sky. A collective breath of relief swept through the group. They had done it. Hayes stood tall, watching the plane climb higher and higher, disappearing into the sky. The first launch had been successful, and with it came a wave of hope, a feeling that they had finally breached the barrier that had held them captive for so long. But even as the plane soared into the clouds, Hayes knew this was only the beginning. The enemy would be watching. They had only one chance to make a real impact, to ensure that their sacrifice hadn't been in vain. "Keep your heads on a swivel," Hayes instructed, turning to his men. "We're not out of danger yet. We finish this airstrip, and we're ready to strike. But until then, we stay hidden." The men nodded, their resolve hardening. This wasn't just about finishing the job, it was about taking control of their fate. Each plane that flew overhead was a symbol of their victory, but also of the growing target on their backs. For a few moments, the men allowed themselves to feel something like pride. The airstrip was finally operational, and the first plane had launched successfully. It was a victory, no matter how small. But Hayes knew there was no time to savor it. As the planes continued to take off one by one, Hayes looked over the crater again, his mind racing. The Japanese would be watching, and sooner or later they would come. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. There was too much at stake, but for now there was a fleeting sense of accomplishment. They had done it. They had turned a barren, hostile landscape into a launch pad for something greater. The first of many strikes had taken flight, and they had succeeded. "Let's keep going," Hayes said, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning." The men gathered their equipment, ready for whatever came next. There was no turning back now. The war was changing, and they had just taken the first step. The airstrip was finished. The planes had launched. For a fleeting moment, Hayes allowed himself to feel the rush of victory, but the euphoria didn't last long. The men were tired, bruised from the relentless grind of survival, but more than that, they were scarred. The cost of what they had achieved was beginning to weigh on them, and Hayes could feel the shift in the air. The sun set over the volcanic landscape, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The last of the planes had lifted off, leaving a trail of smoke behind them. But in the wake of their success, the men gathered around the campfire, their faces drawn, their spirits low. Hayes sat with them, his eyes flickering over their weary faces. There had been casualties, invisible ones that only showed when a man's shoulders slumped, or when his eyes no longer carried the same spark they once had. Even the youngest, the most optimistic, seemed to have aged beyond their years. The war had taken something from them all, something that couldn't be measured by a tally of planes shot down or ground gained. "Captain," Collins spoke up, his voice quieter than usual. He had been one of the first to volunteer for the first launch, but now he seemed distant, withdrawn. What's the point of all this? We've built the runway, we've launched the planes. But what do we have left? What if we don't make it out of here? Hayes knew that question had been gnawing at the back of their minds for weeks. The fear of the unknown had always been their constant companion, but now it was louder. "We're here because we made a difference," Hayes said, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. "Every day we've spent here, we've given the rest of the world a chance. The mission isn't over yet. We still have a role to play." Collins looked at him, his face searching. "At what cost, though?" Hayes exhaled slowly, his gaze lingering on the dying embers of the fire. "At any cost. That's what war is. You don't get to choose how or when it ends. You just keep moving forward." It was a harsh truth, one that had been evident from the start but had never felt as heavy as it did now. Hayes's men had fought not just the enemy, but the land, the weather, and their own doubts, and with every victory came a piece of them that was lost. Some were physically scarred, others, like Collins, carried invisible wounds that no one could see. "I'm sorry," Collins whispered, his voice trembling. "I just don't know how much more I can take." Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a rare moment of comfort. "You've made it this far, that's something to be proud of, but if you need to talk, I'm here." Alvarez joined them, his face stern, but his eyes soft. "We all are. None of us has to do this alone." For a moment, the group was quiet. The only sound, the crackling of the fire. Hayes could feel the weight of his men's struggles, their doubts, their fear. The burden of leadership had never felt so overwhelming, but it was his responsibility to carry that weight, to keep them going, even when every part of him wanted to break under it. The silence was broken by the distant sound of an explosion, followed by the hum of engines overhead. The enemy was closing in again. The threat of discovery hadn't gone away. The planes that had lifted off earlier were a signal, a small but vital step forward in a war that was still far from over. Hayes stood, his mind immediately shifting gears. "Let's get moving," he said, his voice cutting through the haze of fatigue that clung to the men. "We've got a lot to do and no time to waste." The men slowly rose, pulling themselves out of the depths of their own thoughts, pushing aside the weight of the night's uncertainty. They weren't done yet. They had fought through everything to get here, and they would continue to fight. But Hayes couldn't ignore the feeling that this was the beginning of something else, something more than just a war. It was the beginning of a long, hard road, and for some of them, it might be the beginning of the end. As the men moved out, preparing for whatever came next, Hayes stood for a moment, looking at the stars above. In the vastness of the Pacific, they were just a small speck, but tonight they had made their mark. They had survived the first round, and that was something to hold on to. The air was thick with the scent of salt and burnt earth as Hayes stood at the edge of the crater. The men gathered around him. The final days had been a blur, missions launched, enemies engaged, and the relentless pressure of survival pushing them forward. Yet even now, as the war raged on, the thought of returning home seemed like an impossible dream. The first wave of bombers had marked their victory, but the cost had been heavy. Men had fallen, their sacrifices etched into the landscape. Some were buried beneath the very earth they had fought so hard to tame, while others carried invisible scars that would remain long after the war had ended. Hayes turned to face his men, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, resolve, and something else, something deeper, harder to define. They had fought together, suffered together, and now they stood together on the cusp of something greater than any of them could have imagined when they first set foot on this island. "We've done it," Hayes said, his voice carrying across the small group. "The mission is complete. We've built what no one thought possible. We've turned this island into a base that strikes back." Alvarez stepped forward, his face tired but proud. "We've come a long way, Captain. A long way from those first days when we thought the land itself would swallow us whole." Hayes smiled faintly, the memories of those early struggles fresh in his mind. The constant barrage of obstacles, the rain, the tension in the air, the endless uncertainty. They had been tested in ways no one could have predicted, and yet they had persevered. They had done what no one thought they could do. "But we didn't do it alone," Hayes continued, This wasn't just about a runway or a plane taking off. This was about every one of you working together, trusting each other, and making the impossible happen. Collins, who had once questioned everything, now stood with a steady gaze. I didn't think we'd make it this far. But you were right, sir. We didn't quit. And now we've made a mark. It's not over yet, Hayes said, his voice lowering slightly. The war isn't over. But what we've done here, it matters. We've given our side a chance to take the fight to the enemy. We've shifted the balance, and that means everything. The men nodded, their expressions resolute. The past weeks had been a crucible, and it had forged something in them, something unbreakable. They had faced not just the Japanese, but the very land itself, and they had come out on top. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the crater, Hayes allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of the men who hadn't made it, those whose names would never be remembered in the history books, but who had given everything so that others could have a chance at life. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Tonight, Hayes said, his voice steady, we rest. Tomorrow we prepare for what's next, but for now let's take a moment to remember why we're here. The men gathered around the fire, the quiet murmur of conversation filling the air. They had fought through the worst of it, and now they had earned their peace, however brief it might be. For Hayes, the journey had been long, filled with uncertainty, fear, and loss. But it had also been about resilience, about the strength of men who refused to give up, even when the odds were stacked against them. As he looked around at his brothers in arms, Hayes knew that this mission, this island, this moment, would forever be a part of them. And though the war was far from over, the men had already won something far more important. They had won the belief that they could overcome anything. For as long as they had each other, they knew they could face whatever came next. Together.